Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar on financing transportation electrification. This webinar brings together industry experts to speak on the important role financing structures play to electrify personal vehicles as well as commercial and public fleets. My name is Shruti Vaidyanathan, and I am the Director of the Transportation Program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Before we begin with today's content, I have a few housekeeping announcements. Firstly, please note that your webinar screen is customizable. Feel free to make the various windows as large or small as you would like. You can even minimize them to drop to the menu at the bottom of your screen. Click through the widgets at the bottom of the screen to be sure you aren't missing any options available. Next, presentations can be downloaded as PDFs from the presentation list in the menu. Attendees are in listen-only mode, but can submit questions through the Q&A box at any time during the webcast. The presenters will respond to questions throughout and at the end of the presentations. The Q&A can be accessed in the menu at the bottom of your screen if it is not already visible. Finally, all presentations will be available for on-demand viewing within a few days on the Engagement Hub. And with that, let's move on to the content. I would now like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Holmes Hummel, founder, Clean Energy Works, Ben Prohaska, National Director, Electrification Coalition, Robert Gurman, Managing Consultant, Pro Energy Consulting. Let me now turn it over to our moderator and first speaker, Holmes Hummel. Dr. Hummel founded Clean Energy Works to accelerate investments in cost-effective distributed energy solutions to open the clean energy economy to all. Holmes, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Shruti. It's a privilege to be a part of this program. Our commendations to ACEEE for persevering with the Finance Forum, even as we are all participating remote. I've seen the dozens of people who are attendees from all across the United States listed in the attendee box, and the caliber of participation reflects the kind of experience I've had in participating in finance forums held in person in past years. I believe I am able to advance the slides. Is that correct? Or at least I'm trying to.
Yes, I think that's right, Holmes. You should be able to move forward.
There we go. Terrific. So now all of our friends see a picture of the four characters that will be with us during this time. And in fact, we're counting on you to be with us by taking every advantage of this advanced presentation platform to use the chat function and be assertive about your interests. In fact, ACEEE's objective is to attract and benefit the members of the program in a way that also guides our contributions to it. So I encourage you to be assertive with yourself, your other colleagues, and people who are participating using the interactive features of the forum. As a moderator, I was invited also to take some prerogative to introduce one aspect of finance in the transportation sector that brings us right to the seamed edge of electrification of the transportation sector. You'll be hearing from Ben Prohaska and Robert more about electrification of transportation, obviously a strong theme of our program. I'm going to use that moderator's prerogative to bring you through a few charts and graphs that reflect Clean Energy Works' journey in this field, taking insights of experience that ACEEE itself has helped cultivate and curate over many years from the building electrification sector and bring it into transportation. So with that, I'm going to move right ahead to a picture that's worth 1,000 words, because it is essentially a central claim that electrification of transportation is already arriving at cost competitive price points and different vehicle stocks in the transportation sector. And the vehicle stock to cross the line of cost effectiveness first in its own right has been the heaviest vehicles that drive the largest number of miles per year. And the largest publicly owned fleets of that type that we have are in our public transportation sector, in the transit systems. And when we look at the data, practically regardless of which state you're in, we come up with figures that make it look very, very compelling, especially if you were thinking about the time horizon of 10 years. that you would need to be thinking about a fossil-free fleet. And hundreds of cities have mayors and city councils that have already voted resolutions that tell them that's the direction they're going. But they nevertheless find themselves facing this upfront cost barrier, which would drive any city manager right to the finance forum. And of course, at the finance forum, we talk a lot about solutions to overcome that upfront cost barrier. And in other types of forums, those well-attended conferences like the Center for Transportation and the Environment hosts, we find ourselves thinking about how we get the federal funds to pay for the first X% of the market to be transformed, literally by appealing for grant dollars to make up the difference. I'm going to show you a diagram now that gives us a sense of where we go to get those grant dollars. Sometimes we appeal for taxpayer dollars. Sometimes we appeal for ratepayer dollars. Sometimes we appeal for VW settlement money or carbon cap and trade proceeds. That's polluter pays money. But in all three of those species, we found that there are limits to how much political capital can be spent to sustain that kind of spending, and there are limits to how much scale we may be able to achieve with them. And that's what brings us from a transition in the conversation about funding to finance. Here I'm displaying 3 additional rows to the table that make clear that there's an awful lot of work already exploring debt-based financing and lease financing for vehicles that accelerate transportation electrification. Clean Energy Works has found that there are limits and structural limits to how much debt or financial liability can be held on the balance sheets of those that are buying electric vehicles. And their sensitivity to that, particularly in the recession following our pandemic conditions, only been heightened. But the very last row opens up a new window, one into the partnership that every electric transportation fleet in the country may soon be able to find with its electricity supplier. Utilities have for years been able to make investments that capitalize upgrades on the customer side of the meter on terms of service approved by their utility regulators that also allow for site-specific cost recovery. I'll say that once more in the context of transportation to point out that the same type of arrangement is possible, where a utility is able to capitalize the on-site charger and even the on-site storage, the battery on board those buses, in order to recover those costs in a site-specific way without any collateral impact on the neighbors or other ratepayers. I'll speed very quickly through the way that financial transaction is structured to work, where the utility is able to capitalize the incremental upfront cost, and in recovering those costs with a dedicated charge on the bill that's less than the estimated savings, they're able to produce a round trip for the money that actually makes both the utility and the customer better off. It seems like it would be too good to be true, but the truth is that the numbers show us that it gets better every year, that the value proposition for electrification gets better. So we can start now with the confidence that this type of transaction actually has more attractive benefits to the utilities that are joining us today, as well as the fleet managers. This diagram shows that we would start out with an upfront cost barrier of more than $250,000 per vehicle, but with the participation of the utility, we can drop that down by at least 2/3 in the first year and by 3/4 and then 4/5 within 5 years. The length of that crowbar is long. So a city that thought that it was working its heart out to get $1 million in grant funds to buy maybe 5 additional electric vehicles for its fleet suddenly finds that it can get more than a dozen for the same amount of federal funds, state funds, ratepayer funds, or polluter payer funds. No matter where the grant money comes from, it goes farther when funding is in a conversation about finance. And when finance is in a conversation about fleet transition to 100% clean energy goals, we see that we can drop the cost of fleet transition. In this case, a case that we ran the numbers for in North Carolina, a transit agency that allowed us to look at their books and use the utility costs for one of the largest utilities in the United States. We found that the fleet electrification upfront cost barrier dropped by more than 3/4. The stakeholders in North Carolina have engaged their utility commission openly on the prospect of authorizing the first site-specific investment and cost recovery financial program for transportation after more than a decade of demonstrating the same type of solution for buildings. That ends the moderator's prerogative to spike the conversation with things that are beyond the sandbox that many of us are currently familiar with. And I'm eager to turn the program over to my friend and accomplished leader, Ben Prochaska with the Electrification Coalition. Ben is going to take us through the presentation of the Electrification's latest work to accelerate electrification of the transportation sector. And thanks again to ACEEE. I'll be managing the chat box and moderating Q&A after Ben and Robert give their remarks. Ben, on to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Holmes. My least favorite thing in presenting is following Holmes, right up there anyways. So for background, I would put this in the category of, I'm going to focus a little bit on somewhat of an implementation side, recognizing that we have an incredible amount of expertise from Holmes on financing, and then Robert, who's going to follow me. But very excited to be here, and thanks, Holmes, for the always amazing introduction and the great work that we've always been able to accomplish together, and more to come. But background for those who aren't familiar with the Electrification Coalition, and I'm going to advance the slides here. Okay, so we are running EV adoption programs around the country. We basically work on this sort of nexus of policy work at the local, state, and federal level. We then work on direct implementation programs. So when we talk about the idea that, and are my slides advancing? Holmes, can you? It looks like it's advancing. Okay. If it's not advancing, someone can tell me. Okay, great. So we work at this nexus where we bring together the direct implementation with the idea that by doing the work and getting our hands dirty, so to speak, we get to validate whether or not our policy concepts are working, or are the policy concepts the right policies. And some of those examples have come out where we've created a state policy accelerator. We're working in Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina, my current home state. We also help support the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge. So we're working with 17 cities across the country to help them think through some of their broad electrification efforts, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's fleet transition, or it's consumer adoption. And then we're also working on new things like freight electrification, which when you get into the idea of like financing being an important mechanism, and Holmes did a great job of reflecting on this, there's these huge challenges that whether you're a private sector company or you're a public agency, with the idea that you might have a much smaller, and they're probably going to even be smaller now, capital purchasing budgets that you have to navigate, and think about the idea of vehicles that might have a higher upfront purchasing cost, or infrastructure that you have to pay for at the beginning of an electrification effort, but that ultimately is really in many ways an operational cost, right? That infrastructure and even the upfront incremental cost of a vehicle. The battery is a part of that purchase, and so you're really paying for, in many ways, the actual operational costs up front that you're going to save over time. And so creating these financing mechanisms can be a great solution, in the idea that if you're a private sector fleet, you can move more of this money off the P&L sheet, because then it becomes an operational cost and it gets amortized over time. And then, if you're a public sector fleet, there's this idea that sometimes there might be mechanisms to monetize and capture tax credits and other tools that might be out there that can help this transition happen faster. And those are good examples of, by us doing this, by doing direct project application or implementation, combined with these policy opportunities, we're at this really fun, interesting nexus. So just for orientation, we're not an environmental group, so our focus on this is much more focused around the idea that oil has a monopoly on our transportation system. This is a good diagram that helps kind of share that, and it basically puts us at great economic and national security risk. We focus on this also in the idea that if you transition to electrification, it's one of the best scalable alternatives. Not only are we thinking about financing solutions, but part of the reason that EVs pay back over time and at a much better rate is this idea that little squiggly orange line at the bottom is electricity, and it stays much more static and consistent over time. And so it makes sense that this is where you start to see that cost recovery when we're transitioning to electrification over time. versus all these other squiggly lines that are these peaks and valleys that represent some of the other options for transport fuels. So then we looked at this, and this is part of the idea of implementation. Let's focus on municipal fleets. There's a bunch of them, pretty large volume of fleets across the country where there's an opportunity. They're looking at, they have other drivers, whether it's air quality, it might be climate adaptation strategies, other reasons that they've sort of decided to create a goal around transportation electrification. But they ran into a lot of barriers, and cost was one of those. And so I think that's part of the reason that we're here today, is that our program that we've created is helping think about how do you both solve the technical side and also the cost side. So to that end, we've been working on an effort that basically focuses on increasing procurement choice, aggregating national demand, which is then lowering costs and creating access points for financing, and then also helping with some of those pre-deployment planning. And we're doing this through a national effort called the Climate Mayor's EV Purchasing Collaborative. So we have a cooperative purchasing entity that can help bring some of these financing tools to the table that are really solving some of the barriers that exist. So Climate Mayor's EV Purchasing Collaborative, if you're interested, you can check out information on www.driveevfleets.org. And it was really, it's a partnership between Climate Mayors, which is an institution of more than 450 leading mayors across the country, the Electrification Coalition, and Sourcewell, who is that cooperative purchasing entity that I mentioned. And this is some of the ways that we work with fleets to do their transition. So, analysis of current vehicles, best practices, connections to leading fleets, and then also, again, bringing forth some of these solutions that need to exist around financing. And it's not just light duty vehicles anymore. So a big part of this is that we've been able to, I always think of this as like lions and tigers and bears moment, where it started off with light duty because that's the first set of transition, and you can drive those off the assembly line and put them into service. But now we're much more, we're moving in much more into these heavier vehicle formats. And actually we're going to start adding even class 4 through 8 vehicles very soon to the platform, and then also infrastructure, with the idea that by aggregating the demand and bringing all these partners together, we can help drive down some of those soft costs of acquisition. Some of that includes even just national RFPs, where that way each individual city or community agency doesn't have to do its own RFP, but we can help do that as a national effort, and that can really speed things up and reduce time and costs. This is just some of the tools that we're putting in. Whoops, and I advanced too far. So I'm just going to leave it on this slide and just follow up with my last couple notes. And I always realize as I'm doing webinars that I try to fit in 1,000 words per minute. So slow down for a second. The thing I think that we've learned as we start to work with public agency fleets is that they have a traditional purchasing and procurement model. And when you get into EVs and new technology, a lot of times those existing policies and that existing model doesn't allow for new financing options to support that transition or to accelerate that transition. And so you have a capital expenditure budget that can be separated from an operational expenditure budget. And sometimes that operational expenditure budget can be much greater. You also have fleet managers who oftentimes their job is much more about maintaining the fleets and helping with those purchasing options. And then different divisions, whether it's the division of wildlife or the division of water or whatever it is in a given city or a public agency, ultimately has to decide which vehicles they're going to choose to meet their operational need. Well, they might have finite budgets. And so the idea of aggregating that demand and bringing all these things together is it allows us to do things like working with leasing entities who can provide interesting financing models for public agencies to purchase their vehicles. So one example of that is working with D&M leasing or national leasing agency. We've basically developed a tool where they can monetize the federal tax credit. Because if you're a public agency right now, you don't have access to that federal tax credit because you're a non-taxed entity. But a lot of times, cities and public agencies can't do a traditional lease because it doesn't meet the way that their budgeting models work, right? They might budget 1 year, or they might do a 2-year budget cycle. And so most leases might be 3 years or 4 years. And so it creates an issue. And in fact, cities oftentimes can't even sign a lease that extends for multiple years because it violates their budgeting process. And so by working with national, cities across the country, we're able to bring folks like D&M Leasing or National Auto Leasing Group to the table, and they can come up with new solutions like a capital a capital purchase lease, which basically can mean a single payment. You have to do it over several years, and then it creates a much smaller residual value or cost that they can buy that vehicle out. And this then solves some of those problems that can exist where cities and public agencies can access the financing tools that banks and others want to bring to the table. But sometimes, cities and public agencies have been left behind because they aren't taxed entities. And so it's really created interesting challenges. But by pulling these things together, we can bring more of the solutions. We're also realizing that financing can come into play when you get into fleet as a service. And so traditionally, a lot of public agencies have had to own their vehicles, and that's been their operational profile. But it doesn't, it doesn't allow for sort of maximizing the way that fleets might work better, and especially if you have conservation savings with the way that EVs operate, and you can do that spread that out over time. The cost per mile on an EV can be significantly less, and so fleet as a service can actually allow financing to work and support public agency fleets or even private sector fleets for that matter by maximizing those conservation savings over time and driving down that overall cost per mile. So long story short, I think that when you get into new technology, when you're bringing it to the table where there might be higher upfront costs and or upfront capital expenditures for infrastructure, the opportunities to leverage bulk purchasing programs and bringing agencies together can really present new financing options that didn't exist before, or might be able to leverage existing financing options, but just couldn't have worked for public agencies or without a collective group of entities working together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Holmes or the next presenter. And appreciate the time and opportunity from ACEEE and the rest of the presenters.
Ben, thank you. That was a tour de force in the type of solutions that you and the coalition have been able to provide to the city governments who are your primary partners and leading by example in so many states across the country. We do have a few questions that are specifically for you. And because one says question for Ben, I can't resist to just send it your way now. It's particularly about the success of your collaboration with the Climate Mayors Group Purchase Program. How many EVs have been put on the road through the Climate Mayors collaboration with the coalition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've started out, and the program is pretty new. So it started out last year. And I think in many ways, the idea that we have been able to work with over 200 public agencies to make early stage commitments. And I left out a key thing. Our goal in this project is actually these early stage commitments are not 2035, but they are buying vehicles this year or next year, actually, in this case. So far, we have had a commitment of roughly 4,000 vehicles from public agencies, which sometimes that can sound like a small number, but fleets don't flip, right? They don't transition all of their vehicles tomorrow. They have to do this over time because they have to meet budgetary needs. They have to meet their existing life cycle replacements, all of these things that go into how do you transition vehicles as quickly as possible. So at this point, we've gotten that kind of commitment, and then we're on track where those are commitments that people are going to meet by the end of the year. The other thing I would mention is that's mostly and predominantly been light duty vehicles, but now because of the way that we anticipated this and wanted to build out the scale for the program, we're very quickly transitioning into street sweepers, refuse trucks, school buses, and we're building for the future for how do we do this for transit buses as well, with the idea that you can leverage the same model, but then apply it to all of the cross-sectoral options.
Great. Ben, that's terrific. I think I heard you say 4,000 vehicles in the procurement pipeline in the next year or so, and that reflects a huge amount of outreach and consolidation. So it's an advantage to the cities that are taking advantage of it. I also can't help but make an observation on what we learned from your remarks, Ben, which is that even when a mayor is motivated and the city council is committed and the sustainability manager has a plan, and the transportation director is their friend. There are still tons of barriers between their vision and the pavement. And some of those barriers are in the financial arrangements to capitalize that equipment. And some of the barriers are in the financial instruments themselves. You described, for example, the limits on tenor for leasing arrangements. We ran into that at Clean Energy Works, encountering folks that weren't actually necessarily barred from signing a 10-year lease, but because of the revision to the Financial Accounting Standards Board's provisions for leases, all future financial liabilities have to be booked on the balance sheet as debt, or at least in the same section as financial liabilities. That's new as of 36 months ago. And so chief financial officers of public and private entities coast to coast are adjusting to the new norm, which is that even leases will be accepted on the balance sheet as long-term liabilities with a similar weight of debt. And Eversource, a utility in New Hampshire, found that the municipal customers there had to go to a vote every single time the townships or cities in New Hampshire were going to take on new debt obligations. And so the utility was able to step in and capitalize the upgrades for the majority of towns and cities that they serve when it came to building upgrades. And now the open question is, how soon will they be able to turn the corner and do the same thing for transportation? So I think that your problem solving for the cities and showing where the financial instruments can be adaptive is opening up doors where people are already on the path but still encountering some friction.
Absolutely. And I might even mention.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say one quick thing, which is it's also developing, in some cases, new policy solutions. So, in a lot of cases, EVs have been guilty until proven innocent, meaning that they have to show that they can meet the total cost of ownership modeling. And, they're new. And the reality is that with some cities, including a city like Charlotte, we've been able to work with their team to say, let's create a new policy, and it's an EV first policy. So they actually have to prove an EV won't work. And it flips the script on how they think about their financial modeling and how they think about those other policy instruments. And it really causes everyone to go through that process of going, we're committing to this, so how do we do it, instead of how do we get in the way of doing it.
Ben, I like that line of logic. I'll let our discussion rest here while also offering another line to think on for our audience, which is the fleets that take the longest to transition will be accumulating stranded assets for each year that they continue to acquire fossil fueled equipment. And with a presidential ticket that has at least one candidate with a platform pledging that all American-made buses will be electric by 2030, continuing to acquire fossil fuel equipment with a life period after 2030 starts to look like exposure. And factoring in the cost of future stranded assets or lost years of service into the purchase price of a new fossil vehicle starts to make it look much more compelling to turn the corner on fleet transition and start to bring those vehicles in sooner than later. We are going to move forward and leave more time for discussion, because we are ahead of our clock, with Robert Gurman, managing consultant for Pro Energy, who has also had deep ties to the New York Green Bank and worked on developing the New York Green Bank's financing structures, co-writing its EV industry briefing. We're really pleased to have Robert Gurman with us today, and he is going to be talking about Pro Energy Consultants' insights into the field beyond the Clean Transportation Roadmap Initiative of NYSERDA. Robert, please take it away.
Thank you, Holmes, and thank you, Ben. Hopefully, my comments will build on what both Holmes and Ben have said. As Holmes introduced me, I'm an independent consultant with a strong focus on vehicle electrification, particularly on the commercial financing side. My clients include New York Green Bank and NYSERDA, as well as CalSTART and their Drive to Zero program, as well as commercial and financial clients interested in vehicle electrification. First slide, please. Next slide. Am I doing that? Okay. Nope. You went one too far. Yes, thank you. So certainly from what Holmes no, next slide, please. There we go. Certainly from both Holmes and Ben's comments, there is a strong momentum for commercial fleet electrification. This also is Climate Week, and I was just on a couple of webinars. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey outlining their program for electrification across all their facilities and an extensive range of types of vehicles. CalSTART has their Drive to Zero program, and they just made a presentation at Climate Week. And there's no doubt that there is as well significant corporate and public agency interest. These drivers, as both Holmes and Ben alluded to, are economic and TCO convergence, significant innovation, expanding model availability, performance improvements, particularly on the battery, regulations and public policy, and as well ESG and impact investing, which we will get to in just a moment. My focus is on financing, and so the transition to commercial fleet electrification will take billions and billions of dollars of capital. So what my research has been on behalf of CalSTART has to look at the financial community and understand where they fit in commercial fleet electrification. And the overarching conclusion is that there is near universal interest in the financial community for commercial fleet electrification for a variety of reasons. They see it as an emerging asset class. It is a natural adjacency to their already established franchises in clean energy, renewables, solar, storage, et cetera, et cetera. It certainly is a key category to be solved to combat climate change. And as I mentioned, ESG and impact investing, this is a major driver for many financial institutions. Many banks, particularly European banks, are being judged by their regulators in terms of their ESG bona fides. Many financiers want to be out front. A lot of traditional fund managers who have been involved in infrastructure are launching new funds clearly labeled to capitalize on ESG and impact investing objectives, and their LPs as well, the limited partners who provide the capital for these fund managers, they are demanding allocations into these categories. And I certainly have to say that BlackRock's Larry Fink letter to investors and to CEOs last year is certainly a very, very strong and positive factor. But with all of this, there have been very, very few actual financings in the traditional project finance or infrastructure finance types of transactions, commercial senior debt loans. And why is that? Well, financiers see risk everywhere and very few mitigants. And in this slide, I'm talking about financiers as traditional commercial senior debt lenders, commercial banks, and long-term institutional debt holders, as well as private equity and direct equity investors, and getting those two broad categories actively involved and underwriting transactions for commercial fleet electrification is extremely important because they bring large pools of capital, and certainly for commercial banks, they provide low-cost capital and a tremendous amount of liquidity. We'll get back to them in just a minute. But the risks that they see everywhere, residual value, total cost of ownership, we've just talked in the prior two presentations about the significant upfront costs, and that is certainly something that financiers are trying to figure out how to overcome. Utilization and consumption of the charging infrastructure, that's especially true to finance public charging. It's a little less of a problem as we're talking about dedicated commercial fleet infrastructure financings. Certainly, technology and performance are moving targets, all to the good, but they certainly are changing rapidly as we speak. Program implementation and execution. There are, in fact, please go back. I haven't finished this slide. Thank you. Program implementation. There are not a lot of projects out there. The number is accelerating all the time, but nobody has a very, very clear and unimpeachable long track record. Customer acquisition is difficult, and acquiring a pipeline. Transition program. This is very important because even if there are a lot of pilots and phase one programs being implemented or being talked about, I talked to one developer today that thinks they're within a couple of weeks of announcing a major phase one bus electrification program, but it took them a year and a half to get to this point. And that transition program certainly puts these phase one and first pilot programs at risk, because if there is not 100% success, will the transition to the next phase and final phase, full electrification, will that take place? Or will you have effectively new electrification stranded assets? Very, very important. And a few other aspects. Next slide, please. So we've talked about financing models a little bit. These are broad categories, and Holmes and Ben already have showed that there's significant innovation around all of these. Capital lease is difficult to apply for charging infrastructure and fleet electrification because it's usually available only for investment-grade credits, and we don't see a lot of those so far in vehicle electrification. Operating leases, this is a tried and true formula for traditional ICE vehicles. It's highly commoditized and therefore does bring the lowest cost of capital, but residual value is a significant factor, well understood for all models of gas and diesel cars, vehicles, but for electrification, for electric vehicles, residual value is a complete unknown. And so it's an inhibiting factor for underwriting operating leases. Battery lease is certainly holding a lot of promise. Publicly announced Matera have a battery lease hiding program. I don't have any inside information, but from what I understand, there have not been very many transactions under this program. And then charging infrastructure itself is usually based on some form of charging as a service model. And there's great potential in this aspect for commercial fleets and depots. As fleet operators, service contract is effectively a PPA-like type of long-term contract around which you can structure a financing. But note, Ben mentioned that traditional procurement and finance approaches need to be changed, sometimes significantly, and so that's a big inhibitor to using these financing models. And as well, grants, vouchers, and incentives also will play an important role in completing the capital stack. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, commercial banks, very, very interested in this sector, and they bring low-cost capital and liquidity, but the role of banks in the economy is not to take a lot of risk. In fact, they take very little risk, and electrification poses many, many risks, as we just discussed on the previous slide, so I won't go into it again. However, banks as well are concerned with transaction size and pipeline. If you are talking just a charging infrastructure installation, sometimes it could be $1 million, $5 million, maybe $10 million for a large infrastructure installation, but that's still not enough to get commercial banks excited. When you add financing the vehicles, as we've been discussing up to this point, then they start to get interested if you're looking at transactions that are 30, 40, 50 million and more, and are scalable and repeatable. Banks do want to crack this nut, so their interest is strong, and they see it as I mentioned, an emerging asset class and a way to recapture some premium margin, just as in the early days of commercial banks' financing of solar and wind. We are hopefully approaching that stage for electrification, and banks will certainly be able to charge a premium for the next couple of years. Very importantly, green banks and green bonds, they play an active role. As I mentioned, I am a consultant to New York Green Bank and its electrification efforts. Very, very important, but to date, their impact is quite limited. Next slide, please. Equity investors are very important here. They have new concerns, but as well are extremely interested in this, particularly those private equity firms that are involved in infrastructure that have already been invested in clean energy, solar, and wind. And as I mentioned, the fund managers themselves are pointing towards ESG and impact investing, and their LPs are pressing them to do so as well. But they do have concerns, the various risks that we've discussed before, as well as regulatory risk. It is difficult to scale up a business that deals with 50 or so different jurisdictions and state-to-state regulatory formats. So that's an inhibiting factor. As well, private equity firms like banks are interested in large-scale transactions. I've spoken to private equity firms that don't entertain new business that's less than 100 million or 250 million transaction size, and we don't have anything like that in commercial fleet electrification yet. The private equity investors are interested in cash flow, in other words, contracted versus unhedged revenues, cash flow certainty versus uncertainty, and some who have a tax appetite to underwrite tax equity, which again would likely only be present with transactions of scale, meaning transactions where the acquisition of the electric vehicles, the buses, the trucks is part of the transaction. In contrast to commercial banks, private equity has more leeway to underwrite these risks, subject to them believing that they will get an appropriate return. Next slide, please. Venture capital investors play an important part earlier in the life cycle, particularly investing early on in technologies. They are more amenable to taking technology risk than private equity investors, and smaller transaction size. Their concern is seeing the upside through an exit valuation as opposed to cash flow. Next slide, please. The electrification sector has seen significant inflows of capital at the corporate level. These are firms, these are primarily to the stakeholders directly themselves, the OEMs, the charging infrastructure providers. Innovative financing such as SPACs have been used to underwrite acquisitions. I think there will be more and more of this. But again, please note that this is financing for the corporations themselves. This is not for charging station implementation, for acquisition of vehicles. And so the financing from commercial banks and private equity is still going to be very, very important for large-scale electrification adoption. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, financing for charging infrastructure projects has been few and far between. So what will be things that will help promote more financing? We have already talked about some of them. Policy, certainly California and New York State are leading the way. Combination of carrot and in putting in place fuel standards, fleet standards, standards. I think the low carbon fuel standard as a monetization of environmental attributes is going to be very important. Technology will continue to advance. It will improve performance and reducing costs. That's all to the good, certainly from a financing standpoint. I think at this stage, OEMs and their industrial stakeholder investors have to step up for the residual value risk and keep on their balance sheet and take that risk away from any financings. But at the same time, with more and more adoption, creating a database of residual value across models in service will be integral to convincing commercial banks ultimately to take residual value risk. Continued emphasis on commercial application and duty cycles that do pencil today. More and more implementation, successful track record on those particular types of duty cycles can only be to the good, and get those transactions executed and financed, and then move on to more ambitious underwritings. That's it for me. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, please just put them into the chat.
Robert, thank you so much. I've turned my video back on and invite Ben to do the same. We have an avid set of attendees that are hitting it out of the park, beyond graduate level questions, which is also, in my mind, a reflection, again, of ACEE's outstanding practice of leadership in our field. It's obviously a sense of value, the most important field here, what we know. I want to acknowledge that the expanse of questions is going to be more than we can cover in 12 minutes, but that we do have a record of your questions, and to the extent that the three of us who've been invited by ACEE to host the conversation can follow up afterwards, we will. We've seen a lot of interest in the conversations stirred in the Q&A about the use of public capital to address the residual value question in order to eliminate that as a source of uncertainty, and potentially to avail themselves of a green bank type financial infrastructure in order to address the unknowable figure for a decade in the future, so that the world doesn't have to wait a decade to have that number and its figures narrowed, its range, narrowed down. I would like to know if, Ben, you or Robert have been involved in any type of risk mitigation instrument. Not just, I know Ben's made great gains with gathering folks up for new procurement to drive down costs, but to drive down the additional uncertainties about salvage value, residual value at the end of life.
Robert, go for it.
Okay, I'll make a couple of observations. First, in no particular order, but just in the way I'm remembering the various components of that question. Green banks. So these, as I said, I represent New York Green Bank, and I've had extensive discussions with the Connecticut Green Bank and studying a little bit in California. These are set up to be like banks, commercial banks. So they are not going to take residual value risk that a commercial bank would not take. They will underwrite new business models. They will underwrite emerging but mostly proven technologies, and they will underwrite to commercial bank standards. They'll underwrite smaller deals, ultimately so that they can show to the commercial bank community, here we've done it on a smaller scale, and now that this technology is ready for significant scaling, we want you, Mr. Commercial Bank, to underwrite, but we did it according to commercial bank standards. So residual value is going to get a free pass by commercial banks. I did mention in my remarks that the strategics, the OEMs have to take that residual value risk. It's my view that that is part of the transaction that they have to underwrite themselves. But also in my research for CalSTART, I've seen that those OEMs who are best equipped to take that risk are those who have, they're aligned with stakeholder groups that have other businesses that have a second or perhaps even a third life use for the batteries. So they're bringing their very, very advanced and sophisticated understanding of the battery itself, its technology, its chemistry, its longevity, and its reusability. They are bringing that into the equation to take the underwriting of the residual value risk. And I think for the time being, that's the most efficient approach and will result in the lowest cost of capital. I'll stop there, Ben. Please take it away if you like.
You can tell who the financial or financing expert is, and it's not me. But we've tended to focus a little bit more on the idea of how do you solve the problem of residual value in this case, right? Is like the vehicles are coming offline after their use, and what are they worth? And so part of it is if you can define a pathway for purchasing, then hopefully it helps drive up the residual value, right? They're worth more because they're easier to sell, and there's a community that wants to purchase them. And so we've even done things with, start to look at the rental car market. That's a perfect example. It's one of the largest private fleets in the country. Although rental car companies are really challenged right now given the current state of the world. But, if there's a way that they can, after 3 years of useful life, have a direct purchasing process, maybe a public agency, as an example, is ready to buy all of the EVs that a rental car company puts into service and uses for 3 years, and then they buy those as a used vehicle, and they can get another 3 or 5 years of useful life out of those. Those are the kind of things that we've been looking more in terms of de-risking the residual value. Can you actually create sort of a planned purchasing pipeline that then keeps these vehicles moving and sort of moves them to the next owner? And I think there's also things that are showing up where you start to get into solutions for disadvantaged communities, lower income communities. Can those vehicles then be part of a program that could then be incorporated through utility on-bill financing or something else that then could be used to provide vehicles for car share or other ways that you could put used vehicles into servicing? So it's a little bit of an indirect solution to de-risking finance, but it's the idea that if we can solve that, then we start to reduce some of the risk associated with residual value.
Well, like I said, these are questions, and as you can tell from the responses both Robert and Ben have given, they require a fair amount of consideration, but that is the leading edge of thinking for people who are trying to capitalize their electric fleets to get the gains in fuel economy using lease-based terms that require knowing some of these values in order to finish the calculation of the cash flows. There are limits to what a lease arrangement can offer for the fleet managers. And we've talked today already about the range of options that folks who are responsible for making some of these finance or fund decisions are. I'm going to shift our consciousness to the decision-making frame of a policymaker, particularly a federal policymaker, since HCCCE's audiences are nationwide and we all have state transportation and infrastructure bill, the omnibus bill that only passes twice per decade. It's due to pass in 2021 under what looks like the current dynamics that we see. So I'm going to ask Ben and Robert if you have any views on the most important federal policy to accelerate electrification of fleet, specifically because the public policy value is so high. Is it to just buy free buses for all cities, or should we be thinking about some sort of green bank to facilitate the financing to get more leverage? How would we be able to think about combining funding and financing for a more enduring impact?
You go first.
So, I think that the idea that you could make a tax credit transferable would be a really interesting solution for a lot of this, right? So right now, leasing works works well enough, but it requires some gymnastics, is what I'll call it, some financing gymnastics, and it puts people in a position where institutions, where sometimes they're doing things they're not used to doing. It's all the right stuff and it's good things, but it would make it a lot easier. And so Colorado's already done this at the state level where they've made this transferable. And so that makes it a much easier potential solution where there's people who are, looking for that kind of monetization, right? So that's one thing. I think the other part is, that you get into interesting, challenging solutions, even as you get, especially if you get into larger formats, right? There's things like the advanced technology vehicle manufacturing money. Well, that was really designed initially to be something that was only available for light duty vehicles. And so it's a fund, right? It's a capital fund basically that's there to help with manufacturing. But the reality is that as we do move into these other formats, we really need to have a lot more money available. And I recognize this is going outside of what we're talking about a little bit, but the idea that you could get more capital to help drive down some of the costs of manufacturing ultimately is going to solve a lot of problems for the future of these vehicles. We're at this place where you're sort of dealing small format, right? So every part of an electric vehicle is not being manufactured at the same scale that an internal combustion engine vehicle is being manufactured, right? And so it means it costs more to produce. And so if we could put more resources into medium and heavy duty and bus manufacturing, that is going to allow those costs to get further distributed because we're manufacturing things faster and at scale, those costs are going to come down significantly. So I think those kinds of policies are going to make a big difference. And then lastly, I'll just mention, the reality is China is way ahead of the U.S. in terms of its policies that it's created to push transportation electrification. And I think we have to think of things from a minerals to market or a market to minerals kind of perspective, that we really need to be thinking about what is the U.S. supply chain. And obviously, as an organization, we focus a lot on economic and national security issues. So it makes sense. We don't want to trade oil economic and national security issues for battery economic and national security issues if all of those are primarily built outside of the U.S. And so we need to do a lot more work to make sure that we are engaging U.S. ingenuity and U.S. manufacturing capability and capacity to focus on this future of transportation electrification. And that's going to solve some of these issues that come up. And those are indirect financing issues, but they are going to solve a lot of the problems.
Great.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Oh. Yeah, I'll just add that the market, the technology, the player is changing so quickly that I would just hope that any laws are written to be flexible enough to allow for what is going to be different tomorrow than what the law is based on today. I know that's kind of a generic statement, but in directly working on voucher programs in New York and California, the rules were written, some cases 18, 24 months ago, and technology has already changed to circumstances that the voucher program didn't anticipate. So what do? That's not good for anybody. So that's the only point I would make.
Thank you, Robert. You both were admirable in donning your hats as federal policymakers, and those who are on the phone certainly have access to people who are in conversation with folks who are in that realm, especially and including ACEEE. We're at the buzzer. We've obviously been outnumbered by questions. There's one I can't resist, and I'm going to speak to it, and then I think we might have to close the line in 30 seconds. But the question is, what is the role for thinking about integrating the assets of storage aboard our vehicles into the buildings where they're grid connected by charging equipment that essentially provides a ready-made microgrid? And the reason why I raise that is that it does appear that the Department of Homeland Security, which individually approves 23,500 plans for local governments across the country to be prepared for emergencies that situate their schools in almost every case as emergency gathering shelter locations, that within the span of the next decade, the prioritization that's been placed on electrifying those publicly owned bus fleets that are grid connected 3/4 of the time instead of grid connected in transit fleets case only 1/4 of the time, those assets are ready-made microgrid ingredients with very high social value returns and avoided costs to fossil-fueled microgrids, and give us the spectacle of our future where children are taking a vehicle to school that is zero emission, to a location where everyone in the community is safe when they are in danger, and that they are having a learning by doing experience of seeing how on-site renewables and on-site charging for EV equipment constructs a level of resilience that we haven't achieved yet in search of the kind of safety and resilience that the Electrification Coalition was founded to pursue. So I hope by casting that vision out to all of you, I've left you with a sense of inspiration and motivation for the billions of dollars that would need to flow to transform all the aspects of the system that you've heard both Robert and Ben discuss, and that we'll be able to call on ACEEE as our friends and guides for finance forums in the future to continue to develop these conversations. Thank you all for spending part of your day with us, and I hope that this last 60-minute program will continue to stir the conversations through the finance forums sessions still yet to come. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Holmes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.